All right, so before I start, I would just like to state for the record that today is June 23rd, 2020, and my name is Ben Bauman. I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm speaking via phone with Lindel Hume, who is in Princeton, Indiana. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, and we are doing an interview for the Indiana Oral History Initiative. So just to start off, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in Pike County, Indiana. My mother's parents owned a farm, so my grandparents owned a farm, and during the Depression, they were about to lose the farm due to the mortgage they had, and my mom and dad bought the farm from them so they didn't lose it. And so I was born in the same house that my mother was born in.
Wow.
And I was born on June 7th, 1942. I was the eighth of 9 children,
Okay.
2 sisters and 6 brothers. But this was the address was Winslow, Indiana, but we lived in the country, actually closer to Oakland City, which was in Gibson County, but we were across the county line about a mile into Pike County. So
Interesting.
we had a Winslow address, and back at that time, all of my brothers and sisters had been born in that same house.
Yeah.
So it
Wow.
was, the doctor would come out and when he was called and
Yeah.
deliver the babies.
Oh my gosh. That's
And
interesting.
then I was raised there on my dad's farm. They were just coming out of the Depression, and my dad had the farm, but he also had an underground coal mine that he and a couple of my brothers had just dug by hand, basically with a pick and shovel and a wheelbarrow.
Wow.
To dig a coal mine to provide not only for our family, but for some of my dad's brothers and sisters' families that worked in the mine with them later on after they dug the shaft and had 2 mules pulling the cart out of the mine, filled with coal. He also had later on in that same area had a sawmill, but in 1942, the year I was born, he got a job at a coal mine at Elberfeld, Indiana. It was called the Dittany Hill Coal Mine, and so we went from having practically nothing, I guess, before I was born to I was raised in pretty good times. My dad's farm was more of he had about 300 acres of farmland that he owned, but we also farmed about 300 acres or a little more that he leased from the coal company. So we farmed 300 acres grain farming, had about 60 head of cattle and about 5 or 6 milk cows.
Wow.
And that meant no matter how young you were, as soon as you were old enough to get out and do anything, probably at 9 or 10 years old,
sure,
you were working on the farm, and up in the morning school, milking had to be done, cattle had to be fed, chickens fed, all of the farm chores. Then early in the spring, as soon as you got home from school, you got on the tractor and went to the field to plow or disc or whatever. Farming was a lot different then.
Yeah.
So farming 300 acres at that time would be more like some of the farmers today would farm. Maybe 3,000 acres. I mean, it was not that big of a difference.
Sure.
But I worked on my dad's farm with my brothers, and my brother Donald, who I served in the legislature with, he and I were both elected at the same time. But he was 16 years older than myself, and when he was in the military when I was born. So
wow, okay.
He came home from the war, and I was probably about 3 years old by the time he got home from the war. Jeez. And World War II.
Yeah.
And so he came back home to live there, and my first recollection of him was him trying to correct me for something I was doing wrong, and I didn't know who this guy was. I told him to go home.
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
My first recollection of my brother Donald, who he and I later served 22 years together in the legislature.
Yeah.
And he's still doing well, and
yeah.
Anyway, I'm back to the early days.
Yeah.
I graduated from Winslow High School in 1960.
Okay.
And married my wife Judy in November of that same year, and we had a son who was born in December of 1961.
Oh, okay.
And just days after that, and at that point I was unemployed.
Yeah.
Had nothing going for me, and other than still working on my dad's farm. But I got a call on the day my son was born that I was to go to work for Power and Brumfield in Princeton, which is a relay manufacturer, on the 19th of December. My son was born on the 11th.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So I got a good start with my son and my family. I mean, my wife and I. My dad kept encouraging me to go to college, or at least take some technical training. He got his technical training through DeVry Institute.
Okay.
Correspondence, and became an electrician, and was the chief electrician for the coal mine. So he recognized the value of getting some kind of education. So
right.
I wasn't intending to go to college. I had no desire to do that. So I did go to the Technical Institute. It was called TTI at the time, but later was bought out by a company called ITT, which I think just went bankrupt a few years back. But I got an electronic technician's certification from there, which helped me to get a promotion at Power and Brumfield to work in the quality Quality Assurance Laboratory. And by that time, through the encouragement of my brother Donald, who had graduated from Oakland City College, I started to school while working full time. I was taking a half load at Oakland City College, which later became Oakland City University.
Right. Okay.
And I took I majored in mathematics and minored in physics. Graduated from there in 1969. But during the meanwhile, my wife and I had a daughter, Debbie, who was born in 1965. So we had two children. I was working full time and going to Oakland City College year round.
Yeah.
They had a program. They had a program at that time. If you took full load year round for 3 years, you could graduate in 3 years.
Oh, okay.
So I took a half load year round for 6 years and graduated in 6 years. So it was about all I could afford to do anyway. Just taking the half load,
right,
raising a family. And if I'm getting dragging this on too much, you tell me.
No, you're doing well. You're covering a lot of the bases so far, so that's good. I have a few additional questions and stuff about your childhood, but feel free to continue with.
Well, you go ahead with those, and then
sure.
I'll start after that because I'm well out of my childhood at this point.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. So, what were your parents' names?
My dad's name was Austin Hume.
Okay.
And my mother's name was Myrtle Hume. Her maiden name was McRoberts.
Okay, got it. And you mentioned that you had a brother, Donald. Did you have any other siblings?
Oh yes, like I said, I was the eighth.
Yeah. So.
Child out of 9.
Yes. And what?
You want their names as well?
Yeah.
Okay, my oldest sibling was my sister Estelyn. She married Walter Eversole, so it was Estelyn Eversole.
Okay.
Then Donald was the second oldest, Donald Hume, and then my brother Dwayne was 2 years younger than him.
Okay.
And then I had a brother Kenny, who was 2 years younger than Dwayne, and he was killed in a accident with a couple of his friends picked him up. They were going to go play baseball, and they were in a pickup truck crossing a railroad track near our home, and a train hit them and killed all 3 of them.
Oh my gosh.
So that was my brother Kenny. And then after Kenny was my sister Evelyn, and she married Bob Mead, so it was Evelyn Mead.
Okay.
And then after her was my brother Lester, who lives in in Big Rock, Illinois, up near Aurora, Illinois. He worked for Caterpillar there. And then I had a brother, Jerry, who passed away in 2002. And then my younger brother, Richard, who lives in Newburgh.
Wow. So, pretty big family then. That's
I
impressive.
think I got them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope that adds up to 9 because
I think so.
if it doesn't, I missed one.
Yeah, that would be easy to do with a family that large. My goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what, it was a wonderful, wonderful life growing up on the farm with all my brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Close.
Sure.
They were either still at home or as I was growing up, or lived very, very near us. So
right.
Very close family.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Who would you say was the most influential person in your childhood?
You mean of my family?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that in my early childhood was both my dad and mom.
Yeah.
who were hardworking, honest people. Wouldn't do anything wrong under any circumstances. They were as honest as any two people could possibly be.
Yeah.
And did everything they could for us, all of us kids, and which had to be a tough thing to do with
Sure.
that many children. But we did have a farm, so I mean, I didn't have electricity at my house until I was starting in the first grade. So
yeah,
grew up without electricity on the farm.
Wow.
Had a battery operated radio that I recall when I was very young. My mom and dad, you didn't listen to the radio very much because you didn't want to run the battery down.
Yeah, okay.
But they always wanted to listen to the news to see what was going on with the war.
Sure.
So I recall that happening. But mom and dad were obviously the greatest influence on my early life. But probably after that was my brother Donald, who was a school teacher.
Yeah.
And also, he's a quintessential teacher. He was loved by his students, and but he was teaching all of the time.
Okay.
He had to have a student.
Right.
So while we were in the legislature together for 22 years, we were roommates. We stayed together all of that time while we were at the legislature, and I was his only student. So
sure.
It was a constant education for me from him, because he was always he was always teaching.
Yeah.
And such a wonderful person.
Right.
And such a brilliant person. I don't know if you've interviewed him or plan to.
No, I do plan on interviewing him. I haven't been able to reach him yet, but yeah, I'm gonna try giving him a call again in the future and try to schedule something.
Well, he and his wife are in an assisted living facility.
Right.
And so it may be difficult for you to get to him.
Yeah.
But anyway, I really hate to single out any one of my siblings that were more influential on me, because they all were.
Right,
they
of course.
were all very influential.
Yeah.
But Donald was the one. He and I got involved in politics about the same time, although I didn't realize he was involved in politics at the same time that I was.
Wow.
Because
okay.
I ran for precinct committeeman in Oakland City in Gibson County, where I lived. in 1966, and I didn't know what he was doing because he lived in Chesterton, Indiana, near Lake Michigan.
Okay.
So all the way across the state, I had no idea what he was doing politically.
Sure.
I just knew he was a school teacher
Yeah.
there.
Wow.
But he was involved in some campaigns that were going on in that area, and both of us in the Democratic Party, our my mother's father, Alexander McRoberts, was precinct committeeman, the Democratic precinct committeeman. He died before I was born, but he also served as a county councilman and a county commissioner in Pike County.
Yeah.
So we had I guess politics in our blood, but I didn't get it from him because I didn't ever get a chance to meet him.
Right.
But in 1966, I ran for precinct committeeman and was elected, and was precinct committeeman then for about 10 years in the Oakland City area. But and probably the most influential person in my political career at that stage was Bobby Kennedy.
Oh, okay.
Who I truly admired. I felt like he was the one that got John Kennedy elected. I thought he was the brains behind the outfit.
Yeah.
I always thought the world of Bobby Kennedy. And so when he ran for president in 1968, he was in the Indiana primary. I was asked by some of his campaign staff if I would be the coordinator for his campaign in Gibson County, which I was thrilled to death to do.
Yeah.
So that's where I really got my first opportunity to do something other than just precinct committeeman.
Yeah.
Which
Okay.
is an important job, but to coordinate a campaign in a county for a presidential candidate was quite a step up for me.
Right.
Working full time, going to college full time. So it was something that I really wanted to do and truly enjoyed.
Yeah. Okay.
And by the way, we won Indiana.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah. Okay.
Actually won Gibson County too.
Wow. Nice. All right.
But I had the opportunity to meet him. He had a breakfast at the Executive Inn in Evansville for his campaign county coordinators in the southwestern Indiana area. And he, of course, as one of his coordinators, I got a chance to go to that breakfast with both he and Ethel.
Wow. Okay.
It was what you would consider to be a rather intimate breakfast, because it was just the campaign coordinators plus he and Ethel and maybe a couple of their staff people.
Wow.
Who I had met. I lived at that time. I lived in a little 4-room house with my wife and 2 children, and in Oakland City, and it was not a very nice house.
Okay.
It was nice on the inside, but it was one we were renting, and it wasn't a very nice house on the outside.
Right.
And
Okay.
Wonderful neighbors, and so here I was there at home one day, and up drives this big black, really nice car, and 2 guys get out, dressed in suits, which that was not something I never I owned the one I got married in.
Yeah. Okay.
So these two guys come in, knock on the door. Most wonderful people I'd ever met. They, one of them's name was Eugene DeLay, and he kept in touch with me and sent Christmas cards up until just about 10 years ago, and I don't know what happened to him, but he was from the New England area.
Okay.
But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But anyway, it was quite an experience helping to coordinate that campaign, having the opportunity to meet Bobby Kennedy at different occasions, but the one I recall the most was the breakfast, because that's where we had an opportunity to really talk to him.
Yeah.
But I was at events where he spoke all over southwestern Indiana, not just in Gibson County, but so that was what really got me involved in politics. Then my brother Donald moved from Chesterton back to Evansville, and or the Evansville area, and was teaching school at Howard Rusa in Evansville, but living in Pike County.
Okay.
And I lived in Gibson County, but probably about 6 or 7 miles from where he lived, but in 2 different counties.
Right.
And he decided in 1970 that he was going to run for state representative. Well, I had just graduated from Oakland City University, still working at Potter and Brumfield.
Yeah.
Where I stayed with Potter and Brumfield till they moved out in 1998. But anyway, I was out of college, but getting ready to start at the University of Evansville to work on my master's in business administration.
Okay.
But my brother Donald wanted to run for state representative in the primary. At that time in 1970, the districts the district that he lived in took in Pike County, Warwick County, Spencer County, Perry County, and Du Bois counties. And it was a 2-member district. Back at that time, they still had 2-member. Some districts were 2-member districts. And there were 3 people running in that primary. One was Dennis Hickey, who had served several years previous to his running.
Okay.
And the other person who was running, who had not been in the legislature, was Mike Phillips, who you may have heard of him.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
He later became Speaker of the House. But Mike and Donald ran in that primary, and Mike beat Donald by about 500 votes. So,
wow.
And Dennis Hickey was he was in the race, but we knew he was going to win.
Yeah.
It was basically between Donald and Mike, and so Mike won in 1970 and was elected to the House of Representatives. But Donald had said he was going to run again in 72 because the districts were redrawn. And the district he would run in was Pike County and Daviess and Martin counties, with a northern part of Du Bois County.
Right.
So he ran in that race and lost by 2 votes.
Wow. Jeez.
And he decided not to challenge it, but which it turned out to be a good thing, because 1972 was a disastrous year for Democrats.
Okay.
That was the year that Nixon beat McGovern by a landslide.
Yeah.
And the Indiana House of Representatives went from went to a difference of the Democratic Party having 27 members and the Republican Party having whatever the
Yeah.
the rest of it. So they were in a basically a supermajority. The Republicans were.
Yeah. Wow.
So Donald would have been defeated in that general election if he had won the primary, because the Democrat who did defeat him in the primary by 2 votes was defeated in the fall. But then in 74, he said, I'm going to run one more time. And he said, I want you to run, because I was working with him on his campaigns.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think he was more wanting me out of his hair so he might have a chance of winning. I turned out to not be a very good campaign manager.
Okay.
But just a minute.
Sure.
Anyway, in 1974, we both decided to run, and I was just a few credit hours away from getting my MBA from the University of Evansville.
Okay.
But I I decided that I would. I assumed I'd be defeated anyway, so I decided I wouldn't finish up my degree till after the election was over, and then I'd start back in the next spring to finish up my MBA. But we both won in 1974, which was just a complete reversal of 1972, because Watergate just about the Democrats went from 27 members to, I think, 56 members. So it was a huge gain in the House of Representatives in Indiana.
Right. Sure.
So in 75 and 76, when Donald and I served our first in our first term in the General Assembly, we were in the majority. And by the way, the rest of the time I was in the legislature, which was a total of 40 years, I was only in the majority those 2 years.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy.
I was in the minority the rest of the time. Yeah. So he and I sort of had a chance to look at, because we were in the majority, we had a chance to look at the various committees and which ones we thought were the most important, and especially for our districts.
Sure.
And so we decided that we'd kind of try to get on different committees so we would have a greater knowledge that we could share of what was going on in each of those committees. He of course, was very interested in education, and so he was on the education committee. And one of the biggest issues in my campaign, there were two really major issues in my campaign that, and one was the roads. County roads at that time were funded entirely by the state government.
Okay.
The state gas tax was the only funding that cities and counties had for roads, and the state was not funding counties very well. And Posey County especially, which was part of the district I ran in, I had Gibson, Posey, and I think 6 precincts in Vanderburgh County.
Okay, yeah.
So that was the district that I served in at that time. And but the Posey County roads was the big issue because they were basically mud roads.
Jeez.
They hadn't started out that way, but they had deteriorated to that point because of the freezing and thawing, and it just created a real mess. And the people were the local candidates running for commissioner and council. That was a big issue. Who was to blame for the bad roads? And they were blaming the county commissioners, the county councilmen, and actually they had very little control over what they could do because all of the money for roads came from the state.
Right.
There was one exception to that, and that was at that time you could assess a certain amount of property tax for bridges.
Okay.
But only for bridges. So, but when it came to the actual roads, it was strictly money that came from the state, and that was one of the things that I campaigned on because it was a lot of people didn't understand that.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense.
It wasn't a local issue; it was a state issue, even though it was local roads. So that was an area that I was very interested in. So I was on the Roads and Transportation Committee. And another issue that came up during that first campaign was the police and fire pensions. I would meet with the policemen and firemen, and they were all really concerned about police and fire pension. The state established the police and fire pension program, but required that it be funded by and solely funded by the property tax and local level.
Okay.
So it was a state mandate without any funding.
Right.
And so the pensions for and the way the pensions were established was done by the state, but it had to be funded by cities and that was another big issue. And so those were two areas that I took a great interest in.
Yeah.
When I started my freshman year in the legislature and worked on those to the point on the Posey County roads. During that first 2 years, Otis Bowen was governor of the state, and of course he was a Republican, I was a Democrat, so I was laying all the blame for the underfunding of roads on him.
Yeah, yeah.
and the Republican Party for not funding roads, and I would get up and give a Posey County road report almost every day.
Okay.
Demanding that we do something to add additional funding to the roads, and I said especially in southern Indiana, where we have a lot more freezing and thawing than you have in the rest of the state.
Right.
The rest of the state, it might freeze and stay frozen most of the winter, but in southern Indiana it would freeze and and thaw out, freeze and thaw, and that was just crumbling the roads. And so I viewed that as a difference between roads in this area versus the northern part of the state. And I raised so much hell about that at the microphone on the floor on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That I proposed a bill to establish a distressed road fund
Okay.
that only covered about 7 counties in southwestern Indiana.
Yeah.
And it would be it was set up as a special fund that would be distributed based on need in those counties. And of course, the rest of most of the legislature was not in favor of that.
Yeah.
Because it will take money from that from their roads to send to southern Indiana. But
right,
because I was so fervent about my support for that and spoke on it on a regular basis and gave the road reports, that some of my Republican friends said, I'm going to vote for your bill just to get you to shut up. And so I got that bill passed and established a distressed road fund that stayed in effect for many years. Finally, it was changed, but I was in the Senate by that time. But it was in effect for a lot of years and did a lot of good because they were able to improve the roads in those areas that were just back in horse and buggy days.
Right.
But anyway, that was a success for that at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting.
You were talking about positions in the legislature,
right?
In I think it was 1970. It was after the 76 election, so it would have been 1977 when we were reorganizing, and the Democrats were in the minority at that point.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the majority had a majority whip, and I spoke to Mike Phillips, who was the minority leader at that time. Phil Bainbridge had been the Speaker of the House for the Democrats in 75 and 76 when we had the majority, but Mike Phillips was the he was the majority leader, and then became the minority leader in 77. And I asked him, why did we not have a minority whip? And he said, well, I'll check into that. And he did, and he came back and he said, how would you like to be minority whip? And so I was appointed as minority whip in 77. And sir, I was the first minority whip in the House of Representatives. By the way, my brother and I were the first brothers to serve in the same house at the same time.
Wow, that's interesting. Jeez. Okay.
In the history of Indiana, we were the first brothers to serve in the House. Now there was a brother team, one in the Senate and one in the House, during that time.
Okay.
but we were the first to serve in the same house.
Wow. Yeah.
And then so a couple of firsts there.
Yeah.
And I think that since then, U.S. Senator Mike Braun had been elected to the House of Representatives, and his brother had been a member of the House of Representatives. But I think before they actually served together in the House, his brother was appointed to some position and left the House. So I don't know if they ever actually served together in the House.
Yeah, I would have to check that. That's interesting.
But they certainly didn't serve together as long as Donald and I did. We were in the House together for 8 years.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Seatmates for 8 years and roommates for 22 years.
Yeah. Wow.
But anyway, so I was a House Minority Whip first, and all the time I was in the House, it was the House Whip. But Mike Phillips was a big influence on me in the House Representatives. He told me early on, this was when we were in the majority. He said, get that rule book, the House rules. And he said, study that.
Yeah.
And study the state constitution, because that's what controls what we do here.
Right.
So I did that. I made it a practice to. I mean, the rule books are not really that big.
Right.
Not tomes of information, but it still. Very few people took the time to study the rule book and to know the rules.
Yeah.
And even fewer took the time to study the Constitution. And that also controls how you legislate, what you can and can't do. So, doggone, I don't know what the heck's happened. I guess I'm not used to talking this much.
No, that's okay. Well, I think a lot of times people are surprised about how much they actually have to say. So, which is good. That's what we want. We want people to be, to have lots of stuff to tell us. So that's the whole point.
But anyway, I took that information that Mike gave me about studying the rule book and the Constitution, and I continued that when I went to the Senate. And
yeah.
I served in the House from 74 to 82, ran for the Senate in 82, and was elected to the state Senate.
Right.
And Frank O'Bannon, who later became governor, was the minority leader in the Senate. And so I went to him and I asked him, I said, why don't you have a minority whip? I was minority whip over in the House. Why don't you have a minority whip here in the Senate? He said, well, I'll check on that.
Okay.
And so he checked on it and he said, well, would you like to be the minority whip? And I said, yes, of course. Minority whip in the House and minority whip in the Senate, neither one paid any additional. It was just the position which required you to kind of poll your members to see where they stood on issues. And
right.
So it was a position of some import, but not a great deal when you're in the minority.
Sure.
But we didn't have quite the split that you have in the legislature now.
Yeah.
It was closer. So a lot of times when majority had a piece of legislation they were interested in, they didn't have all the votes on their side. They needed votes on our side. So you needed the minority whip to know who would vote for what.
Sure.
So that was, doggone it. This is irritating. Let's see, where was I?
Oh, you were talking about just the, how much has changed between the demographics of the House and Senate in terms of political parties and.
Yeah, like I said, only in the majority that first 2 years didn't even know what the difference between majority and the minority was that first 2 years.
Yep.
Because I had never experienced the minority.
Right.
Which, by the way, there's a lot of Republicans in the legislature today that have no respect whatsoever for the minority because they've never been in their shoes.
Yeah.
Most of the Republicans who are serving today have never served in the minority. They've always been the majority. It's like being born with a silver spoon in your mouth and not recognizing that you have that. But so anyway, that was just kind of touching on what was going on in the House. Like I said, my brother and I were seatmates for 8 years, and
sure.
And then in '82, when I was elected to the Senate, I was campaigning. A lot of my the things that were driving me and what I worked on and what I was really interested in came from my district and talking to people in my district.
Yeah.
And although road funding continued to be an issue, and I worked on legislation to get the gas tax increased while I was in the House of Representatives, and I was on the committee that was established to look at road funding, and so we came up with a gas tax increase, and it was my suggestion that rather than us fall behind constantly on funding roads, that we should, instead of having a flat tax on gasoline, we should have a tax on gasoline that was based on the price of gasoline.
Okay.
So it would be a percentage of the price of the gasoline would be the tax. But if the price went up and the tax went up, it was kind of ratcheted. In other words, it didn't go back down.
Right.
The tax stayed. The price might go back down, but the tax didn't. It stayed. which a lot of people might not be in favor of, but that's what I thought would be helpful to provide the continued funding that we needed for roads. And we were able to get that passed, and it stayed law for, well, I was in the Senate when they changed that.
Oh, okay.
But they moved it back to a flat 18 cent per gallon tax.
Interesting. Okay.
So I continue to have that interest in roads. Plus I found it early on. I found it was really important to get to know the head of the at that time it was called the Department of Highways, and because you'd be out in your district and find a state highway that had a terrible pothole or a dangerous condition. You could get on the phone and call the head of the Department of Highways, and because I had always, even though they were usually of the other party, they were still friends of mine, and I would be able to call them and say, hey, out here on Highway 57, really a dangerous situation and needs to have this or that done to it.
Yeah.
And they would take care of that right away.
Right.
And so I sort of looked at that as part of a legislator's job to try to take care of the roads in your district. And I recall campaigning in Bicknell, Indiana.
Okay.
And that was when I was running for the Senate the first time. And I was knocking on doors, going door to door. And I came to this nice brick house, knocked on the door, and an elderly gentleman opened the door and was talking to me and invited me in, and he and his wife offered me a cup of coffee, and so we sat down at their table and had a cup of coffee, and they were talking about how they were going to have to sell their home, and that they had always farmed their entire life until they retired, and they sold their farm, and the profits from the farm they used to build this home in Bicknell. And but their property taxes had gotten so high that they didn't have enough income to pay their property taxes, so they were going to have to sell their home and move to a less expensive place with lower taxes.
Wow.
And that really hit me.
Sure.
The unfairness of property tax, and how it how unfair it was, especially to elderly people. And I started studying property tax and learning everything I could about it.
Right.
And looking at ways that we could reduce property tax and do it on a permanent basis, so that it wouldn't just go right back up, because it typically, when the legislature or Congress cuts taxes, they have a tendency to go right back up over time.
Right.
And so I was looking at a way to I just felt that the taxing on property was wrong from many standpoints, but especially for homes like this couple had.
Yeah.
It was also unfair, I felt, for businesses as well. And so I started a crusade to eliminate property tax. Well, everyone thought I was crazy, which was probably right. But anyway, that year after year after year, I would put in a constitutional amendment. I'd file a constitutional amendment to eliminate property tax. Well, there's a lot of people who agreed with me on it, but that would have meant raising other types of taxes, and they weren't too fond of that. So anyway, I finally narrowed that down, because if you looked at the property tax at that time, by far the majority of the property tax was used to fund schools.
Okay.
So I narrowed my quest down from eliminating property taxes to a constitutional amendment that prohibited funding schools through property taxes,
Right.
which would have been a dramatic decrease. It would have meant the state would have had to take over funding schools, but which you could have just filed legislation to do that. But I wanted a constitutional amendment because I knew that, or my concern was that we would take the schools off property taxes, but then we would start adding things back on, and the property tax would go right back up. So that's why I wanted a constitutional amendment. Just a minute, I'm going to have to take another drink.
Sure, no worries.
But so there were things, and I had said earlier that I was concerned about the police and fire pension plan.
Right.
Well, even when I was in the House, I was working on that, and we did get legislation passed to fund the police and fire pension plan with, at first, it was funded through a cigarette tax. And so that reduced property taxes on the local level that was mandated to go to fund police and fire pension plans. But it didn't completely eliminate the local portion of it.
Oh, okay.
So, and later on, after we had passed gaming, the lottery, we established a fund that, from the proceeds of the lottery, that would go to fund police and fire pension.
Right.
So we did get that taken care of over the years, but it took some time to do it. I'm kind of meandering around here.
No worries. It's I mean, you're covering a lot of ground, so that's pretty good. But yeah, whenever you're ready, I have some more questions to perhaps point you in a certain direction. But yeah, what you're doing is good. So.
Well, anyway, that was what got me started on the trying to reduce property taxes, which that became one of my main goals that I spent a lot of time on in my early years in the Senate. It took up until I think it was 2006 or so before we finally got something done to fund teachers' retirement so that it was not totally dependent on school funds.
Right.
And then later on, we got legislation passed to take school funding off of property tax and funded by the state. So that made a dramatic decrease in property tax. And
sure.
So some of those things that I worked on for so many years eventually came to fruition. So anyway, now what's your
Yeah, so I guess you kind of hinted at how you first sort of developed into a politician. Do you remember what the first sort of time was that you really started to have a political outlook? Was it in your childhood, or was it in college, or?
Well, I think it was before. It was in my childhood.
Okay.
I remember a very good friend of mine in, I can't remember what grade it was, but it was, it would have been in 1952, I think. A friend of mine was a Republican.
Okay.
And he was in school. In grade school, he was supporting Dwight Eisenhower.
Okay.
And I was supporting Adlai Stevenson.
Okay.
So we had our own little campaigns. And I was somewhat of an artist. I was pretty good, and I drew a picture of Adlai Stevenson on a poster board, and took that to school. And it was the teachers kind of encouraged that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that was probably my first real taking a position, and you had to learn about the candidate you were supporting and the differences between the two.
Right.
And but I think also growing up, my mom and dad and my grandparents all were truly devastated by the Depression.
Sure.
And FDR was kind of our savior in the views of my family, and
yeah.
So FDR did some rather dramatic things to turn the economy back around, and to created the WPA, the CCC, and Social Security.
Sure.
And so I recognized the impact that the Democratic Party had, because the Republican Party didn't support those things.
Right. Yeah.
And so anyway, that's sort of laid the foundation for me being a Democrat.
Yeah.
And it has always been, and still is, my feeling that the Democratic Party has always been the party that has tried to do things that help the individual who's got a daily working job,
Mm-hmm.
and not a wealthy businessman or a wealthy industrial company, or looking out for those who are less fortunate,
Right.
and a much broader tent of bringing people in, and trying to support people who have, for no fault of their own, but have very difficult times. And sometimes people, it is their own fault, but I never felt like that you could write people off. And I felt like the Democratic Party was the one who stood up for people, especially the people who were who had more difficult times.
Right. Interesting.
And so that formed early in my life as a result of hearing about the Depression and hearing what happened and seeing how that affected my parents and my dad's parents. I did get to know my grandparents on my father's side, and also my grandmother on my mother's side, but I never got to meet the real Democratic politician in the family, who was my grandfather on my mother's side.
Ah, okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So that's sort of where I got the foundation of my political views, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Moving back to when you first got elected, what did it feel like your first election day?
First of all, I was running against a 4-term incumbent.
Okay.
And he was a radio announcer on one of the most popular radio stations in Evansville, so everybody knew his name, and he was on the radio constantly.
Okay. What was his name?
Joel Deckard.
Joel Deckard. Okay.
Joel.
Okay. Yeah.
Joel Deckard. He had served 4 terms, and I was basically a precinct committeeman who had never run for anything other than that.
Yeah.
And I was working on my MBA at University of Evansville, and the guy who had run against Joel Deckard in 1972, the Democrat who ran against him in 1972, was Sam Blankenship, and he just coincidentally was in an economics class that I was taking at U of E. We were in the same class.
Oh, okay.
And I was really pushing him to run again. I was really trying to get him to run again. And he said he wasn't going to do it. He just continued to refuse to even consider it.
Yeah.
He was defeated so badly in 72. And so he said, well, why don't you run? And I said, I've never run for anything other than precinct committeeman in my life.
Right.
and he said, well, why don't you run? Well, none of us knew at that time, and that was in early 74.
Yeah.
And, before the primary, none of us knew that Watergate was going to have the effect it did on the 74 election.
Yeah.
And so it came to the last day to file, and I could not get him to file, and he told me to file. Well, a friend of mine, Terry White, who was my campaign manager in every race I ever had, and still a dear friend, he and I got in the car, drove to Indianapolis. First time I'd ever been in the State House. Went to the Secretary of State's office and filed for state representative with absolutely no thought of winning.
Yeah.
But and no one else thought I would win.
Wow.
I wasn't making a lot of money, so my campaign was going to be run on a bare bones budget.
Yeah.
And it was difficult to get contributions from anyone. My brother Donald was running, and we weren't going to try to get our family to support our campaigns.
Yeah.
So I think that the Democratic Party, out of Indianapolis, Phil Bainbridge, drove down to Princeton and met with me and gave me a check for $500. And during that campaign, I spent about $2,500 on that campaign.
Wow.
Which you'd have to, if you were going to run a race for that same district today, you'd have to spend $250,000.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Then I used $2,500. But we made the most of it because we campaigned constantly. Every free minute that we had, we were out at every gathering. I would go to county council meetings in Posey County. I'd go to city council meetings in Mount Vernon and Princeton, and I'd meet with the police and fire, and I'd meet with farmers groups, and I would, anywhere that I could find people, we would pass out some brochures that we had printed at a local printer here in Princeton. And so we worked hard, but it was still in the back of our minds. We knew we didn't have a chance of winning.
Right.
Because everyone knew Joel Deckard because of his radio background and the fact that he'd been the state representative for 4 terms. And so we Terry White and I and my wife, we really studied each precinct and the numbers in each precinct and how they voted the last time and what we could expect as a turnout in each precinct. And we on election night, we were watching that and had the TV on. After the polls closed, and of course we were out on election day till the polls did close, handing out brochures at precincts that we felt we might have some kind of an impact on. We had different people located at different precincts, and so we went around, picked everyone up, and then stopped by a restaurant and had a bite to eat, and then came to my house and had turned the TV on, and first precincts came in, and the precincts in Vanderburgh County where Joel Deckard lived, he just beat me by a few votes.
Yeah.
Which shocked the devil out of us. And then we got to looking at what was going on in Gibson County, which is my county, and we went to Princeton where they were counting the votes, and I was doing relatively well. I was beating him in virtually every precinct, and so it came down to what was going to happen in Posey County, and those precincts came in, and I had defeated him by around, I think, 800 votes,
okay.
which was a close race, but it was, but you talk about, I mean, my kids were doing cartwheels in the living room, and I was about as excited as they were.
Yeah.
And at that time, I could do cartwheels.
Yeah.
So we were all just truly very excited about all that, because first of all, we didn't really think we had a chance, but to win it was just one of the most exciting times of my life.
Yeah, sure.
That very first win, and then we were also on the phone talking to my brother, and he was checking, and he was leading too, and he won. So it was quite a night.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Did your feelings change with each re-election? Or did you get used to winning, or was it exciting every time?
No, I did. As a matter of fact, my brother and I knew that we were going to be one-termers.
Okay.
We knew that from the very beginning, because we knew how successful politicians were.
Yeah.
A successful politician can go into a crowd and know half the people in the room.
Yeah.
Maybe know everyone in the room.
Right.
Well, hello, Joe. How are you doing, Joe? How's your family? How's your kids? How's that little girl of yours? And all this stuff. Donald and I, neither one could remember a person's name from the time they said their name till the time we turned around.
Right.
It must have been a Hume trait, because we couldn't remember people's names, no matter how Dale Carnegie didn't help me at all in that respect. I took Dale Carnegie course the one year I was out of college and not
okay, yeah.
Before I started at U of E, and so we knew that there's no way in the world that we'd get reelected no matter what, because we also recognized that Watergate had that impact, because by that time we were seeing that it was not just in our area, but it was all over the state and all over the country.
Yeah.
That Watergate had that impact. So we assumed we'd be a one-termer. So the next time we both had opposition, and not in the primaries. Neither of us had primary opposition, but we did have opposition in the fall, and they were always well funded.
Yeah.
So it was each one became a down to the wire, counting each vote.
Wow.
For both of us. And that is that way every year that I ran in the House.
Wow.
Every 2 years. Well, you never quit campaigning when you're in the House of Representatives.
Sure.
You're out attending meetings. You devote your life to it, basically.
Yeah. Did you have to change your campaign strategies at all, or?
No, did the same things.
Okay.
Attended every meeting we possibly could.
Yeah.
But did that year round though. So, and even the years when you weren't campaigning, you were still trying to go to as many meetings as you could, and so that was and the strange thing about that first year, I had taken a very strong position on labor, and served on the labor committee.
Yeah.
And I got a tremendous amount of support from labor as a result of that. And Bill Hayes was the congressman that was elected in 1974, a Democrat. beat Roger Zion, who was the Republican. And so he had decided he was going to run against Vance Hartke in the 76 election for U.S. Senate. Phil didn't like serving in the House of Representatives in Washington, so he was going to run for the U.S. Senate, and that was occupied by Vance Hartke, who was a Democrat, so he ran against him in the primary, which left that seat without a Democrat running.
Yeah.
Well, the labor groups in Evansville got together and started working on me to get me to run for Congress.
Okay.
And I certainly felt, honored by that. They had a big dinner and at one of the political restaurants in Evansville.
Sure.
And had me come, and they introduced me and endorsed me to run for Congress and wanted me to run for Congress. And I really did not want to run for Congress. I didn't want to be away from my family that much, and
yeah.
And I just really did not want to run for Congress, but they were insisting that I should. But
sure.
But I didn't, which I'm still glad I didn't.
Yeah.
Even though the Democrat who did run won that year.
Okay.
The guy out of nowhere, and he still won.
Wow. What about what was your first impression, or what were you thinking when you first walked into the State House for the first time as an elected official?
It was about the same as it was every time I walked into that State House.
Yeah.
I was always in awe.
Yeah.
Even up to when I left there, I retired in 2014 on my own. I was probably the luckiest politician ever. I served 40 years and was never defeated.
Yeah.
And it was just you felt humbled walking into the State House, and you felt in awe because it's just so full of history.
Sure.
And you felt like you were becoming a part of that history.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, it was thrilling in a way, but a feeling of awe.
Yeah. Okay.
And even when I would walk out of the State House at night, and many times, you didn't get out of there till you'd work at your desk until 9 or 10 o'clock, and you'd be walking out, and you may be the only one walking in those halls.
Yeah.
And that was I still had that feeling of just a reverence for that institution.
Yeah, that's neat. What about...
Of course, any time I walked out of there, though I usually was not walking out with myself or by myself.
Yeah.
Up until 1996, when my brother retired, and he wasn't defeated either after his first two primary defeats. He wasn't defeated either. So he retired on his own in 1996.
Okay.
But up until then, anytime I walked out, he and I walked out together because we stayed together, we drove together, we we did everything together.
Yeah. What about what were your expectations for the legislative process, and was it more or less complicated than you expected?
Well, it's difficult to say that it was more or less complicated than I expected because I had no idea.
Yeah, sure.
I was totally ignorant of the process until I got there because, like I told you, the first time I'd been in the State House is when I went there to file in the Secretary of State's office. But now it was it was just something that you relied entirely on people who had been there for some time,
right?
Who could help you and help walk you through the process. It wasn't like today, and I'm not sure that I even think the way it is today is good, because they have basically, after you're elected, they start having, right after the election, they start having meetings of the newly elected legislators who basically go to school on how to be a legislator.
Yeah.
And so they have, I haven't been there since 2014, but I'm assuming they still do the same thing. But a new legislator comes in, they go through a training process. And I've always felt like that takes away a little bit of the individual spirit of the legislator.
Okay.
Because you're being trained, and who knows what propaganda is being brought into your mind while you're going through this training process.
Sure.
But and when I was first elected, the Legislative Services Agency was not nearly as sophisticated as it is today.
Yeah.
That was pre-computers, and you would sit down with someone from Legislative Services, one of the attorneys, and you would actually sit down and write the legislation with them.
Yeah.
That really, so I guess you were kind of learning from the attorneys in Legislative Services on how to prepare legislation.
Right.
Going through the filing process and everything was something that you learned from your friends, like Mike Phillips had been there before us, and he took both my brother Donald and I under his wing and pretty well taught us everything we needed to know.
Okay.
On how to get things done. And other legislators, Jeff Hayes, who was from Evansville, who has since passed, was a good. He was a big help to us. He had served there earlier too, and so it was a different system than they have today, but I think it was good, because as a legislator you learned, and you learned from other legislators, not from people who are coming in to train you to be a legislator.
Right. Sure. What about your interactions with your constituents? What was that like?
Well, that was probably, and probably still is today, the best thing about serving in the legislature.
Okay.
It is the interactions that you have with your constituent. I have to say that I was really fortunate from the standpoint that I don't. I think I could count on one hand the number of times that I had someone who confronted me that wasn't just very nice and
Yeah.
very, very respectful and just easy to talk to, and if they had a problem, they'd tell you what it was, and you'd do everything in your power to help. And that's one of the things that with the staff over the years that I was in the legislature. When we first started out, we didn't have any staff. Our offices were our seats on the floor.
Yeah, sure.
We didn't have offices. You stacked everything you had under your seat or on top of your desk on the floor, and we didn't have cell phones, and they had about 8 phone booths set up just off the floor of the house. So you needed to call, or if you got a call from someone, they'd call in, and someone would come in and get you, and you'd go answer the phone. So it was totally different. But the constituents that I dealt with over the years were always so nice to me.
Yeah, that's great.
And I if I had to say there's one thing I miss about the legislature today, it is that contact with constituents.
Yeah.
Because that was the best part.
Sure. What about the interactions with other members of the General Assembly? What were those like?
Well, it's a tale of two legislatures.
Yeah.
Legislature prior to the Tea Party and then the after Tea Party.
Yeah. So you've had an interesting, you would have an interesting experience about this because you've served in so many different sort of time eras of the Assembly. So.
Yes. Prior to the ultra right gaining so much influence in the Senate, and all of the time I was in the House, whether you were a Democrat or Republican, you had friends on both sides of the aisle, and you'd kid around together and you'd do things together, and it was there were issues you disagreed on,
right?
But 80 to 90% of the legislation that passes in the legislature is probably true today. Is that it's a bipartisan vote,
right?
And but the way you were treated before the ultra right came in was so much different, so much better.
Yeah.
A much better relationship across party lines.
Interesting.
And one of the reasons that I decided to retire from the legislature was that it just wasn't the same.
So why do you think that sort of transformation took place?
Well, there's this, of course, is just my opinion.
Sure.
But was back in the late 70s, early 80s. There became a much more a greater divide between the parties,
Right.
and the Republican Party became much more conservative, and so you had more and more conservative members. And to give you an example,
Okay.
the President pro tem of the Senate was Bob Garton when I first went into the Senate in 1982.
Yeah.
And but he was one of the legislators that I considered, and still do today, considered a friend. And he respected my knowledge of the rules of the Senate and the Constitution, and would appoint me to the Rules Committee, even though the Rules Committee usually didn't bring in the minority whip, and it was usually the upper leadership. But he would always appoint me to the Rules Committee, and we worked together so well, and were good friends. And as a matter of fact, when I retired, and they had a little retirement party for me, Bob Garton came to that and said, "Lindel, don't retire. We need you up here."
Ah, okay.
And that was, but over the years, the Republican Party kept shifting more and more. And I think you probably never heard of him, but Lee Atwater, who was an active member of the right wing of the Republican Party back during Reagan's era. He started the ultra right, and then there were others who would take who took up where he left off, and it finally created this almost a huge percentage of the people felt that government was bad.
Okay.
And so we've got to reel in government. We've got to do away with the people who are in there, and bring in people who want less government.
Yeah.
So there was a drive to do that, and I think that was sort of the birth of the Tea Party. Which I hate to even dignify it with that name, Tea Party, because that supposedly tied to the Boston Tea Party, but
okay, yeah,
absolutely no connection. I mean, no, nothing in common whatsoever.
Right. Interesting.
with the Boston Tea Party. Anyway, that trend continued, and finally, Bob Garton, who was, I think, and maybe still is, the longest-serving president pro tem of the Indiana Senate, was defeated by one of those Tea Party guys down in Columbus, Indiana. And I just couldn't believe that happened. But and then once the Tea Party, or the I'm going to call them ultra right, because I don't like to even use the term Tea Party.
Sure.
but the ultra-right members of the Republican Party, and they took an organization that I was a part of, and they made it a part of the Republican organization, as opposed to being the Right to Life organization. When I dealt with them over the years, they were a bipartisan group, and we had members in the Democratic caucus that were opposed to abortion, as I was and am.
Yeah.
But that wasn't good enough, because the Republican Party was able to take that and twist it and call Democrats baby killers.
Okay.
There's not one Democrat that I know at any level of government that's in favor of abortions.
Right.
They're not in favor of abortions. A lot of Democrats are in favor of a woman's right to choose, but there's still a lot of Democrats who feel that that the choice, that there has to be a good health reason,
right,
for any kind of an abortion. But
sure,
there are other Democrats who think that a woman should be able to choose. But I'd always been pro-life, and before I even knew there was an organization called Right to Life, I was pro-life.
Yeah.
That first year that I ran, I didn't know there was a group called Right to Life. They never contacted me. I never knew anything about it. But my own position at that time was that I was opposed to abortions. And but the Republican Party has been able to take that and change that from an organization that is a bipartisan organization trying to prevent or to reduce or prevent abortions. They've changed that into a wing of the Republican Party, and it's usually an ultra-right wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And the same thing holds true with the National Rifle Association. There is no way on earth the Democratic Party is going to remove the Second Amendment from the Constitution.
Right.
I mean, anyone ignorant enough to be afraid that the Democratic Party is going to take away their Second Amendment right just simply means they have no idea what it takes to change the Constitution.
Yeah, true.
I mean, I was there when we voted on the Equal Rights Amendment.
Right.
And Indiana passed the Equal Rights Amendment. But for Pete's sakes, it takes 2/3 of the states have to ratify. It has to pass Congress, and then it has to have 2/3 of the states ratify it.
Yeah.
I was there when we passed the constitutional amendment that Birch Bayh, who was the U.S. Senator at the time, got through Congress to lower the voting age to 18. I mean, I know the process, and I know how hard it is
Sure.
to get a constitutional amendment, and especially if it's a controversial one, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And but the NRA is no longer a bipartisan gun owners group. It's not a National Rifle Association for people who are out here with their shotguns and their pistols, target practicing, and their rifles going deer hunting.
Yeah.
They don't represent that group. They are a wing of the Republican Party now. I had when I was in the legislature, every year I'd have an A plus rating with the NRA on votes. But if there had been someone run against me who was a Republican and was, they would have, NRA would have supported them in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing holds true for the Right to Life organization. They are no longer a bipartisan group for their issues. They are wings of the Republican Party. And that has all shifted into this ultra-right group that is now, even though they didn't have a majority of the majority when I was there, they were the ones. It was the tail wagging the dog, because every moderate thinking Republican in the Senate had to go along with whatever the farthest right member of the Senate wanted to do, because they knew that if they didn't, they'd be challenged in the primary by an ultra-right, just like Senator Garden was, and be defeated.
Yeah.
So they went along with some of these things that they didn't honestly believe in, but they knew they had to do it to protect their position in the Senate.
Yeah.
So anyway, it got to the point where it just wasn't the same.
Right. That's interesting. What about since you served in both the House and Senate, what were the differences between the House and Senate, in your opinion?
I always like to say this because I think it pretty much sums it up. The Senate is like a botanical garden.
Okay.
And the House is like a zoo.
Oh man.
You've got 100 members and they're all up and about and doing their thing, and I went through a period of time where you didn't want to go into the House of Representatives if you were a member of the Senate or the public.
Yeah.
Because first of all, it was embarrassing.
Yeah.
The things they were doing. It was a period of time when John Gregg was Speaker of the House, because he came from the back row as a back row legislator, and he was right in the middle of all of the silliness and childishness that was going on, and they would pin. You'd walk in and you might not even realize it, but when you walked out, you had pinned onto your coat or taped onto your coat.
Oh my gosh!
Kick me, or it was just childish stuff that was going on constantly.
Wow.
But even before that childishness and that nuttiness went on, there was never the kind of decorum in the House that there was in the Senate.
Yeah.
The Senate was always relatively subdued. If I were going to take school children to the legislature, I would have taken them to the Senate, but I would not have taken them to the House, because that was not a good impression. When I first went into the House, it wasn't that way. Yeah, there was more decorum.
Right.
But it just gradually got rowdy.
Yeah, that's funny. What did you think about the process of generating a bill?
It was pretty much the same in the House and the Senate.
Okay.
I think over the years that I served in the Senate, the being in the minority in both, I felt that there was more consideration for your legislation if you were a member of the minority in the Senate than there was in the House.
Yeah.
And it was much better from that standpoint. Although we went through a couple of years there where the chairman of the committees, which of course have been Republicans, had been told, do not give a Democrat a hearing on a bill.
Okay.
If they come to you with a bill that you think has merit, tell them that you will give them a hearing on the bill if they will have their name removed and put you on as the first author.
Wow.
And so consequently, House members, Democrat or Republican, would never send a bill to the Senate, to a Senate Democrat, to be the first sponsor on a bill.
Interesting.
Because they knew they wouldn't get a hearing on it if they did that.
Thanks.
So, but that went on for a few years, where you just knew you weren't going to get a hearing on it. I had a bill that virtually everyone supported, and it was in the Education Committee. It had been assigned to the Education Committee, and I went to the chairman of that committee and asked for a hearing, and he said, "Well, I really like this bill, and I want to give you a hearing on it, but you're going to have to take your name off and put my name on as the author, and then we'll have a hearing on it." And I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to play that game."
Right.
It's a good bill. It needs to be heard, and it's something that's going to be good for the state, and you know it. And so, if you're not going to give it a hearing with my name on it, then it just won't get passed. And so it didn't.
Wow.
I didn't get a hearing on it, but I didn't take my name off of it either.
Do you think has that changed at all, or is that still the way it works?
Well, that only happened for a couple of years.
Okay.
So I'm sure it's changed.
Okay.
But I do remember going through that period where here's probably the difference.
Okay.
The Democrats are in a super minority, especially in the Senate.
Yeah.
So the Republicans don't feel threatened by them in any way. So they probably are more willing to give hearings.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Simply because it's, unless it's a bill that's put out there, it should be a political bill.
Right.
They're playing games in the first place. But if it's a bill that has merit and would have bipartisan support, I'm sure that they give them a hearing, because what's the Senate got now? 10 Democrats or 9?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly.
So, it's not a big threat.
No. Yep. When it came to voting on bills and legislation, did you have a good idea of how people would vote before they actually voted?
Well, of course, that depended on whether it was a controversial bill or not. like I said earlier, 80 to 90% of the bills are bipartisan bills and are supported and pass with over 90% of the vote in favor of it.
Yeah.
It's only the controversial bills, and as the minority whip, I knew how our members were going to vote on controversial bills, and my assumption was I knew how the Republicans were going to vote, according to what the bill was about. But
yeah,
if it was controversial, it was usually going to be supported. If it got that far along, it was going to be supported by the Republicans, and sometimes a few of the Republicans would surprise you because it would be so far right that even they would cross that line.
Yeah. What would you say the public doesn't know about how the Indiana General Assembly operates?
I think probably the biggest misconception that the public has is that party makes no difference. They assume fairness. They assume that party labels are not going to determine what happens in the General Assembly, and that everything is handled on every piece of legislation is handled on a fair and open basis.
Yeah,
and they don't understand. I'd say the majority of the people do not understand the divisiveness of the parties.
Okay.
And how how important it is who's in charge.
Yeah.
It's like me when I was first elected. I was in the majority and I didn't know the difference.
Mm-hmm.
It took serving in the minority to really fully understand the difference between the majority and the minority.
Yeah, sure.
I remember when Kermit Burroughs was Speaker of the House when I was in the House of Representatives, and and Kermit had a way of always letting a Democrat get a bill or two through committee and on the floor for a vote. And at that time, the Speaker of the House is the one who handed down every bill.
Right.
They'd bring out a bundle of bills there before the Speaker, and he'd reach in the basket, pull out a bill, and say, House Bill 1881, Representative Coldren. And the author of the bill would stand up and explain the bill, and it would go that way all day long. And you would always get a large pileup of bills for the last day or two. May still be the same way, but there'd be a huge number of bills on the calendar for the last couple of days. And you'd go talk to, I'd go up and talk to the Speaker and say, Kermit, are you going to hand my bill down today? Yeah, I'm going to hand it down. Yeah, I'm going to hand it down.
Okay.
And we'd be in session till 11 or 12 at night on those last few days. And so because and you never knew when your bill was going to be handed down. It wasn't done in any order. It was whenever the speaker handed it down. And so you sat in your seat, you were there, you voted on every bill, and you were kept there because you knew your bill was going to be called down.
Sure.
And you had to be in your seat when the bill was called down. And so you'd sit there and you'd sit there and you'd sit there, and then the last bill would be handed down, and you'd still be sitting there waiting on your bill. And he'd say, okay, I'm open, the chair is open for a motion to adjourn. And that'd be it. And it would be the last day. Your bill was dead from that point on because it didn't get called out.
Wow.
But that happened to me so many times. But they would use it. They would use it as a way to keep everybody in their seat instead of just walk out and not come back. I mean,
yeah. Interesting.
But that happened to me a number of times, and it always pissed me off. And I'd always I'd let Speaker Burroughs know exactly how I felt about him.
Yeah. Okay.
Of course, that like water off a duck's back. He didn't worry about that.
Yeah.
He achieved his purpose.
How did your legislative service affect your family life?
Pardon me?
How did your service in the General Assembly affect your family life?
Well, that's something that most people have no idea.
Yeah.
Back now the legislature is run much more efficiently than it had been before. And most of the time you're only there. I forget what the schedule was, but it was Monday, Tuesday, then Wednesday would be a committee day, and Thursday, and then you'd be off Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd actually leave Thursday night to drive home, and you'd be home Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then go back to session on Monday. But
yeah.
I never, and I've always felt badly about this, and I especially feel badly now, but I was glad I didn't know this when I retired in 2014, but later on that year in 2014, my son, who was 55 years old in 2014, he after this was I had retired in 2014, so that meant my last day in office was election day,
right,
in November of 2014. Well, about 3 weeks after that, my son went in for his stomach had been bothering him. He went in and got tests and ran a colonoscopy, and they found out he had stage 4 colon cancer.
Oh my gosh.
and so that was, he got the results of that back in December of 2014. So 2015 and 16, and then he passed away in February of 2017.
Wow, that's terrible.
He lived here in Princeton, and so during that period of time, I would be over at his house a lot.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time with him.
Sure.
When he was feeling well enough for us to do anything. But all of the years that he was growing up, I think he kind of resented me being in the legislature. My daughter, on the other hand, she got a big kick out of it. She liked it.
Okay.
she liked me being in the legislature, and she'd come up and had free reign of running all over the state house.
Yeah.
And and my wife was very supportive, and so but it was my son who I never got to go to, with the interim study committees you have in the summer time. I didn't get to go to his ball games, or
okay.
I didn't get to spend time with my son that most parents do, or my daughter either, for that matter. But so it and in 2000, it was about 2007 or 2008. I was reelected in 2006, and so that next year or so, my wife said, "Why don't you not run again?"
Okay.
Well, that would have been 2010. Would have been when I would have been up for reelection.
Yeah.
And so I told her, I said, "Okay, I've been there. I've been there plenty long. I don't need to be there any longer. I can retire." Someone else would come along and do a good job, and so I had agreed that I wouldn't run in 2010. And then, I don't know, sometime maybe a year after that, in 2008 or 2009, she said, "Oh, I know you want to run again. Why don't you run one more time, run in 2010, and then retire?" And so I agreed. That's what we'd do. I'd run one more time in 2010 and then retire.
Okay.
Well, I did file, and I ran, and no one filed against me. Wow. So I was running unopposed, and then my wife went in to get a knee replacement in May, and they screwed up on the anesthetic and just really burned her lungs.
Oh my gosh.
And so they said it'll be about 3 weeks. And they had her in the hospital down in Evansville for about 3 weeks, and she hadn't improved at all. And so they said, "We want to send her to Indiana University Hospital there in Indianapolis. And there's a really good pulmonologist there that I think can help her."
Okay.
And so we went to Indianapolis, and she was in there for about 2 weeks, or a week or so, and the pulmonologist said, "I'd like to take a biopsy of her lung." Well, always my understanding of biopsy was like a needle biopsy, small,
right,
sampling, and so my wife said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to make that decision for you. You decide whether you want to do that." They had said it was going to take probably 6 weeks or longer of steroid treatments to clear it up.
Yeah.
But the pulmonologist wanted to do a biopsy of her lungs. Well, they'd done every kind of test, CAT scans, MRIs, anything and everything you could think of. So they knew what was going on with her lungs. So I'm not quite certain what the need for a biopsy was, but
sure.
But my wife finally, I went in that next morning, and she said, "I've decided to go ahead and have the biopsy." Well, when they did a biopsy on her, it was a major surgery, and they cut 3 sections out of her lung, and then clamped them back together.
Jeez.
And she was intubated, and when they do that, they put you into a drug-induced coma. And so she was in ICU for about a week, and in a drug-induced coma.
Wow.
And they called my son, his wife, and my daughter were up there at Indianapolis. We were all over the hotel, and you get a call that morning, and they say, you need to come over here because your wife, we don't think your wife's going to make it. Well, we never had any idea that she was that critical condition.
Jeez.
And so we get to go over there, and anyway, it was probably about 3 hours she passed away.
Oh my gosh.
And so anyway, I was, if I had been opposed in the election, I would probably have withdrawn.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't in any condition mentally to go through a campaign of any kind.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but since I wasn't opposed, I didn't withdraw. But I had told her I wouldn't run again, and so I knew that I was not going to run in 2014, even back then.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
So it does impact your family.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing that being in the legislature or not being in the legislature would have affected her outcome. But it was just a situation where, I every year for either 2.5 months or 4 months, I was away from my family.
Yeah.
And so that has an impact on, I don't care who you are.
Sure.
If you got a family that you're very, very, very close to, and then that really becomes a bad part about serving in the legislature.
Yeah, it can be tough. Yeah. Wow. Now, earlier on, you had mentioned some legislation that you had worked on during your time there. What would you say was the most controversial legislative issues that you dealt with during your time in the Assembly?
The most controversial legislation that I dealt with, that I personally had, or that
just that you may have interacted with, in terms of voting on. What were the big topics going on during your service?
Well, I think you have to understand the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
Yeah. To
recognize what becomes big controversial issues.
Okay.
On most issues, you'll have Democrats on this side of the issue, and you'll have Republicans on the same side. You'll have Republicans on the other side, and you'll have Democrats on the other side. And
right.
It's all over the place. But when it comes to legislation affecting the working individual,
mm-hmm.
And if it's legislation where the Republican Party feels that it's negative to the business community,
Right.
then it's going to be a very controversial piece of legislation.
Yeah.
As an example, and probably I hadn't thought about that, so there may be other big issues. But
Sure.
Probably the most controversial was the right to work legislation that passed, which took away the strength of the unions.
Okay.
It just basically gutted the unions, and it happened. It wasn't an Indiana singled out only state in doing that. It was something that was being done in every Republican-controlled state in the nation.
Yeah.
They were taking away the power of working people to join together and to stand up for the fact that they are a part of the business. They are, one side of the business is the capital, which the Republicans only consider. But a business that is nothing but capital is a business that can't operate. You have to have the labor as another part of that.
Sure.
And labor needs to be compensated, and their conditions and their safety and every aspect of the contribution to a business that labor puts into it is just as important as the capital that someone put into it.
Yeah.
And the Republicans do not see that at all. They don't even consider that. It's, you take that job, or if you don't take it, somebody else will.
Right.
Well, they don't recognize that people have devoted their lives. They've established their way of living and their lives based on that job, and they're doing everything that they can to make that company succeed. But the Republicans don't care about that. They just care about the guy that put up the capital.
Interesting.
And the stockholders. And so when it came to taking away the strength of the unions, and the Indiana Chamber of Commerce has always had a substantial influence on the legislature, and particularly the Republican-led legislature. And so it doesn't make any difference how worthy the piece of legislation might be relative. If it's brought to them by the Chamber of Commerce, it's going to get heard, it's going to get passed.
Yeah.
And especially now that they have a supermajority.
Right.
But that was probably as far as a general piece of legislation that was controversial.
Yeah. Okay.
that was one that it just truly a split that should have opened the eyes of a lot of working men and women in this state. That the party that actually supports the working men and women, and a lot of working men and women aren't members of labor unions, but I guarantee you that every working man and woman is a beneficiary of the negotiations that the labor unions have achieved over the years. Their safety in the workplace, their pay levels. If you're working at a factory that is non-union but doing the same thing that a factory down the road is doing that is union, the non-union's going to pay about the same as the one that, and they're going to try to be as close as they can, because that company that's non-union doesn't want to be unionized.
Right.
So whether you're a member of a labor union or not, if you're doing a job that would make you, by definition, a member of labor, maybe not organized labor, but labor, then you are benefiting from what labor has done and is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the history of what labor has done to improve working conditions in this nation as a whole, every working person has benefited from that.
Right.
And so that was a very controversial, but equally controversial, but less known to the general public, is the redistricting legislation that comes up every 10 years.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I mean, gerrymandering is a way of life, and it's not Democrat or Republican. If the Democrats had control, they would gerrymander just the same as the Republicans. It's just a part of the beast.
Right.
And the party that's in control is not going to give up that power to gerrymander and draw districts in favor of their party. And the party that's not in control is not going to want to give it up, because they're hoping they get in control and they'll be able to do that same thing.
Yeah.
So it's very controversial, because districts are drawn with micro precision anymore.
Sure.
And you'll see districts that are split up and by precincts, because this precinct votes heavily Republican, so we want it in that district. This precinct votes heavily Democrat, so we don't want it in there. We're going to put it over here and dilute it with this, and so the people, and I served on the elections committee in both the House and the Senate, and I was the ranking minority member on the redistricting committee.
Yeah. Every
year that we redistrict, with the exception of 2011, I was in 1981, in 1991, in 2001, in 2000, and in 2011 I wasn't. But
sure.
We as the minority party had the same the same mechanisms of drawing lines, the same computers, the same database.
Yeah.
We had everything that the majority had, so we could see just exactly what was happening with whatever maps they gave us. We could run the numbers on it.
Yeah.
And we could supply them with maps which would do just the opposite and put us in control.
Yeah.
And so I had that opportunity to serve in that position, which was not only, it was worse than a thankless position, because your own members, after the Republicans drew the map and there wasn't anything that you could do about it, your own members would say, well, you took such and such out of my district.
Yeah.
I didn't have anything to do
right.
with it. I was in the minority. They didn't come to me and say, what do you want to do here, Lindel?
Right. Yeah.
But that is something that the only way that's ever going to be changed is if there, and I don't think I'm not sure there's any way you could even do it, because if you appointed a bipartisan commission,
Yeah.
You're going to have the partisanship, and then the Constitution requires, you'd have to have a constitutional amendment, because the Constitution requires that the legislature will determine the seating of its own members, and so they have a constitutional right to say whatever maps are drawn and whoever draws it, we're the ones that have to pass it.
Right.
And so they'd never pass one that they didn't want.
Sure.
If they had the majority, if the Democrats had the majority, they would. So it's a really, really difficult issue to resolve, and I'm not sure how you do it, but a bipartisan commission where that you absolutely had to have an agreement by both parties, and that's never going to happen.
Right.
So we'll continue to have gerrymandering, and the Republicans will without question be in control in 2021. So they'll maintain the districts very much the same as they have them, or tweak them a little, so that instead of having 10 Democrats in the Senate, you'll have 9. It's amazing how precise the numbering is, and the data is that helps you to know exactly how a district's going to vote. And the unfortunate thing is, you think, well, these are people. How do you know how they're going to vote? Well, you go. People don't seem to change that much.
Yeah.
And even though we have a mobile society, and a lot of people move around, it seems that it doesn't have enough effect to change that.
Right. Yeah, that's
it's still very predictable.
Yeah, that's definitely a kind of a very interesting thing about government that I think a lot of people are kind of just wondering, like, why does this happen? But yeah, wow.
And a lot of people aren't concerned about it because they don't understand the difference between the majority and the minority.
Yeah. Yeah. What legislation that you worked on would you say that was most complex?
Most complex.
Yeah.
Well, through the years, I was either author or I wasn't the author. I was, because if it was a very complex issue, it wouldn't have been me authoring it. It would have been I was the second author.
Okay.
But I was the second author on legislation to establish the Department of Transportation.
Okay.
The Department of Transportation, prior to its current organization, was a conglomeration of Department of Highways, and each segment of transportation had its own little department. And so I was on the legislation that established the Department of Transportation. In 1985, Senator Joe Corcoran, who was from in I think Lawrence County.
Okay.
He was a Republican from that area, and he and I were authors and second authors of creating the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and those were fairly complicated because the Department of Environmental Management was the state Department of Health had various arms, and some of them dealt with water quality, some of them dealt with air quality, some of them dealt with all of the various things that are now. Well, they also had all of the other things in the health related field that the Department of Health still has today.
Sure.
But all of those environmental aspects were just kind of off in branches. And we put together legislation to combine that into the Department of Environmental Management. And so that was pretty complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Over the years, I like I was telling you how I would be involved with something that was going on, or I'd meet with a constituent, or some issue would be brought to my attention, and then I would champion that issue, and I served on. I was fortunate enough to serve on the what when I first started serving on was called the Senate Tax and Finance Committee, and it was later divided up into the Senate Budget Committee and the Senate. It was two committees. It was Finance and Budget, and so I forget what they're called today, but there's two. I served on both. When they split them, I was able to serve on two committees, both one on taxation and one on budget. But so for years I served on the Senate Budget Committee, and plus I served for several years on the State Budget Committee, which is not just legislators but also members of the governor's office, and you travel around all over the state to during the summer to each of the state institutions of all types, and you see what's going on. I've visited virtually every prison in the state of Indiana, every state university, state parks, any place that's a state, a part of the state government that is spread out all over the state, that comes to the state for money, and we have to then put together a budget based on those requests. The State Budget Committee goes to those institutions. You listen to what they're wanting. You then spend maybe 3 or 4 days there, and you walk around and you see what they're asking for, what they're going to do with it, and if you're going through the prisons, you see the conditions there, and that got me very interested in trying to do something about our judicial and our correction systems.
Yeah.
And I spent the last several years working on issues that I'm not an attorney, but I served on. As a matter of fact, I was probably the only one on those committees. Both the Judiciary Committee and the Courts and Criminal Codes Committee. I was probably the only one who was not an attorney.
Okay, interesting.
But I was very interested in what we could do, because you can't just continue to just lock people up. This country has more people locked up than any country in the world.
Right.
And we need to be doing more to try to make life better for people. And those people that are in prison, do what you can to help them so that they don't come back. That this leads off to another story, but I worked with the head of the Department of Corrections, and he was explaining to me how that if we offer, and he was the head of the Department of Corrections during the the Mitch Daniels administration.
Oh, okay.
But he was a terrific guy. The head of the Department of Corrections was, and he was very thoughtful and recognized that we were just not doing. The Constitution says that it would be the Department of Corrections. It's not the Department of Punishment.
Right.
It's the Department of Corrections. You're supposed to be trying to do something to correct bad actions. But he was explaining to me that 80% of those who are incarcerated that take some form of additional education while they're in prison, 80% of those never come back to prison.
Interesting. Wow.
And of those who do not take any additional education, 80% of them do end up back in prison.
Wow.
So it seems like it seemed to me like a pretty simple thing to do everything you can to help educate and keep people from coming back, because we had so many people who were they were in for a while, and it's like he said every one of these people except those who are in for life or have the death penalty, they're eventually going to get out.
Yeah.
So if we don't want them to come back, then let's do something that we can to help so that they won't come back. And education was the key. So I became a very strong proponent of providing education to people who were in our correctional institutions.
That's interesting. Okay.
But at the same time, and not any connection to that right now, I'll tell you the connection later, but right now I'll just say I was also a member of the Board of Trustees for Oakland City University.
Okay.
And then I had always been a strong proponent of providing education for those people who are incarcerated.
Right.
And so I served on the Board of Trustees for a period of time, and then I realized that Oakland City University was one of the major providers of educational programs for prisoners.
Wow.
And so I resigned from the the Board of Trustees because I felt it was a conflict of interest.
Sure.
No one suggested I do that. No one. I even talked to the Speaker or the President Pro Tem of the Senate about it, but and he didn't recommend that I resign, but I did. I resigned because I felt very strongly about providing funding for those educational programs in prisons.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel right about doing that and knowing that a significant part of that was going to Oklahoma City University.
Yeah.
That I served as a member of the Board of Trustees. So I resigned from the board. They have since I've retired, asked me to come back, and I've told them that I'm retired.
Yeah.
but I explained to them why I was resigning, and they understood that.
Yeah.
But it was something that I still feel very strongly about, and I was very involved in rewriting, even though like I said, I'm not an attorney, but
right.
I was very, very much involved in rewriting the criminal code for the state of Indiana, and
okay.
and trying to make it less likely that someone convicted of shoplifting a loaf of bread wasn't automatically put into a felony position that required them to go to prison.
Right.
And we had that as a part of our law. Any theft was a felony that you could be sent to prison for and spend 2 or 3 years in prison. And it didn't make any difference what. And we raised that. I think it had to be something over $750 before it was something that would send you to prison.
Yeah.
But I just felt that we were just sending too many people to prison, and it was a dead end for them. It was just they were going to be getting into a cycle where they were going to be coming right back in again. So they'd be out for a while, they'd get with the same old gang, and because they didn't have anything to do, couldn't get a job, and they'd be right back in prison for dealing drugs or whatever it was they were in there in the first place.
Yeah.
Or taking drugs or whatever.
Right.
And so I felt we needed to really do things to try to keep from sending so many people to prison, try to do things to help people. And I worked for a long time with a lot of different people within the Department of Corrections and all of our committees to help resolve or to make that at least a little better.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have made some improvements, although we still have a long way to go. But it's just there's just so many things.
Sure. Yeah. Makes sense.
There was a guy here in town. His son, I believe, was, I think, 18 years old, and he was dating a girl who was 13 years old. And the girl's parents let him come and stay with them, and so he was 19 and she was 14, and then they signed the papers when she got old enough for him to marry her, and so they got married. but when they were dating earlier, she had a baby.
Oh.
So the baby was born while he was 4 years older than her, and she was underage.
Yeah.
And so he was married to her, and then she decided she was going to divorce him, and this was some years later. And so they were going to have a fight over who got the child, and her attorney said, "You don't have to worry about that. We've got the birth date of your child. You were underage. He's guilty of child molestation, so he'll go to prison."
Yeah.
And they filed charges against him. They convicted him. They sent him to prison.
Wow.
And his dad was so upset he committed suicide.
Oh my gosh.
And so I just felt there's something wrong with this system.
Yeah.
And I looked at laws in other states and a lot of states had what's referred to as the Romeo-Juliet law. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not. No.
But the Romeo-Juliet law is one that says that if you're dating and you're 4 years difference in your age, and you're dating and the girl is underage, then that can be extenuating circumstances, and you're not necessarily going to be charged with I mean, it's like a boy and a girl in school together.
Right.
You know, one might be 14 years old freshman, and the other one might be a 19-year-old senior.
Yeah.
And they're dating, and then so you're going to send this 19-year-old senior whose girlfriend because he's a child molester, and he's going to be on a list. He's going to have to sign up the rest of his life as a child molester. And anyway, we got the and this took a lot of cooperation of my friends on the Judiciary Committee and the Courts and Criminal Code Committee. Senator Steele and I worked on that a lot together. But we got that Romeo-Juliet law passed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it was too late for this guy and his father. But it's there are things over the years that I've worked on that I feel like I've made a difference.
Okay. Yeah. That's, wow. Yeah, another, just shows how complex some of these issues can be.
Yes, it's not, it's just not, everything's just not easy.
Yeah.
You know, this is totally off from anything you've asked me, but
okay.
One of the things that I felt very good about, and I worked with Senator Garden and Senator Joe Harrison on computerizing the Senate.
Interesting.
And this was back in the early 90s. Now, I had I don't know how old you are, but this is a lot old. This was before your time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, I had a Tandy, which was Radio Shack's brand of a computer.
Okay.
I had a Tandy laptop, which almost no one had a laptop. There were Radio Shack. They called Tandy Radio Shack
Okay.
Trash. They called them trash.
Yeah.
It was Tandy Radio Shack computers, but Tandy came out with this 1100 HD. It actually had a hard drive in it.
Wow.
Now you have to understand, my first computer was a Commodore, and it didn't have a hard drive in it. It had these 5.5-inch floppy disks that you slid in. That was the program, and anything you used it for came off on disk. And but anyway, this Tandy HD 1100 had, now hold on to your hats, because it had a 20 meg, not gig, meg hard drive.
Yeah.
And it used the little about 3-inch hard or insert floppy drives.
Right. Wow.
And I used that all the time. I used it. I worked at Potter and Brumfield for 30 years, and then worked. And Siemens bought Potter and Brumfield in 1986. So I started working for them in '61, and in '86 Siemens bought it, but kept the name Potter and Brumfield. And I worked with them. Until they sold out to Tyco in 1990, about 1999. But then I continued to work for Siemens New York as a contract employee. But during all that time I worked for Siemens, I had my own little Tandy HD 1100 that I used at work, and you stored any letters or whatever I was working on. You'd store that on those little hard drive or floppy drives. But you could, with the hard drive on the 20 meg, you could have a word processor, which I did have.
Yeah.
And it was a WordPerfect word processor. And so I would take that with me to the legislature, and I was the only legislator who had a laptop computer that I take down on the floor, and I'd take it up to my desk, and I could work on correspondence with my constituents and just give the floppy disk to my secretary, and she'd put it in her computer and print it out and send the letters to my constituents. But Bob Garden and Senator Joe Harrison from Attica, he was the Senate Majority Leader, and Bob Garden was President Pro Tem. And they had decided they were going to put a PC, and you may not even know what a PC looked like, but a PC at that time had a cathode ray tube like the old big TV sets.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I mean, they were like a 1.5 feet tall, and at least that deep. They would take up your whole. Anyway, they had 4 of those set up on the leader's desk, both the minority leader and the assistant minority leader, and the president pro tem, and Joe Harrison, who was the majority leader. They all had those on their desk. I mean, it was taking up their whole desk. It was going to sit there year round and only be used during session while we were on the floor of the Senate. So very little usage.
Yeah.
And they hired a guy by the name of Vasily Kaloulias, who was originally from Greece, but he had worked with the Legislative Services Agency, because the Legislative Services Agency had started computerizing, and so he understood computers and had his own company, and met with Garden and Harrison, and they were working on a plan of putting those PCs on everybody's desk.
Interesting.
But they were just trying it out with the 4 leaders to see how it would go. And so they had Vasily come to my cubicle because they knew I had that laptop, knew I had some computer savvy.
Right.
And so they had him come to me and ask what I thought about what they were doing. And I said, well, I think it's stupid. And because I said, just think about it. It's taking up the whole desk, and you're not going to be able to use it anywhere except down on the floor of the Senate. And it's going to be sitting there on that desk all summer long. And so it's just going to be used for 3 to 4 months each year.
Right.
And I said, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. I said, now, if you were to be talking about using a laptop that you could take down on the floor, and I showed him mine, and it was probably maybe a 10 by 10 when you opened up the screen.
Okay.
And it was not a big laptop, but it worked. And I said, now, if you had something like this, you could not only use it here, but I said you could download the information, and if you got a good enough computer, because I kept up on what was going on with computers, and they were really increasing the memory capacity of computers.
Yeah.
I said if you did that, you could download the bills on your computer. You could take them to your weekend, because every Saturday morning, somewhere in my district there was a legislative meeting, and I said you could take that, and if somebody asked you a question about Senate Bill 123, you could just pull it up and you could say, yeah, that's in such and such, and then or it's passed out of committee, or it's here or there. You could give an update on everything.
Sure.
And so he and I talked about this for like hours, and so he went back and reported to Senator Harrison, who Garton had put in charge of that computerization. And Harrison asked me to come down to his office, and we talked about it. And so they started working on it from that standpoint then, and bought some NEC. I don't even know if NEC's still making computers, but they made laptops then, and they were one of the first ones to come out with a touch pad where you could activate an icon by just touching it with your finger.
Okay.
Like your iPad has today. But so they brought, I think they bought 6 or 7 of those, and they gave one to me, and so we went through the whole process of how to use this, and we had one legislator from Evansville, real good friend of mine, really nice guy, but he was the kind of person, he was like he was as old then as I am now, and he wasn't the kind of person who was going to take to change. Mm-hmm. And my advice to them was, if you're going to set up this system, you've got to set it up in such a way that it's so easy that even this particular senator that I won't mention can use it and will use it. I said, you got to make it easy enough that even he will use it.
Right.
And so that's where they started working, and they'd keep coming back to me for my input, and I became a part of that committee then that established that. And Indiana was the first state in the nation, and very likely the first legislature in the world to have their legislature completely computerized.
Wow, that's interesting.
And we worked through every step of the programming process to make sure that it was as close as possible to the paper system that we had always used before, so that they could operate simultaneously. So if some legislators wanted the paper version of the bill, all they had to do is ask for it.
Yeah.
But if they didn't want to deal with that stack of 80 or 90 bills on your desk, you could have them all on your computer. And we had the best program, a whole lot better than the one that they're using there today. I think today they're using iPads.
Mm.
But we had the NECs, and they were a whole lot better because it was a system that was designed specifically for the Indiana legislative system and the way we operated with all of the legislation.
Right.
And my brother was involved in doing the same thing over in the House. So I know that would have been back, he retired in 96, so I know that would have been back in probably about 92 that we were doing that. And that was, if you look at how computers have progressed since 92, you'll find that there's they were pretty primitive at that time.
Big
but
change.
We were on the cutting edge with the NEC touch pads, touch screens.
That's interesting, yeah.
But there was a big write-up in one of the national legislative magazines where they came and they took pictures of me and Vasily and wrote a really nice story. I forget the name of the magazine, but it was a going. I mean, it was talking about how innovative our system was and how it was the only one in the country. And so Indiana was first in that respect, and I was a key player in getting that done. Felt very good about that.
Yeah.
I think most people take that kind of thing for granted anymore, but when it comes from starting from scratch and developing a system like that.
Sure. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Well, I've bored you for so long.
No.
Any other questions?
I do actually have some questions left.
Okay.
This is actually interesting. Don't worry, you're not boring me. You have all sorts of unique stories. So this is great info. Let's see. I had done a little bit of research on some legislation or just some issues you had been reported to have been involved with in the newspapers and stuff in Indiana. One thing was about, I guess it was in 1999, you were talking with other legislators about limiting campaign contributions from people connected to the gambling industry. Do you remember anything about that?
No, I don't. But
okay.
I fully I mean, I think that was just kind of a no-brainer.
Sure. Yeah. It was interesting to see that was being discussed. So it's like, yeah. Let's see. There's another one in 2005, which I thought was kind of interesting, given today in society there's so much debate about sort of historical figures or how things should be represented in symbolism, where I guess there was a ruling going on about whether someone could bring up the name Jesus Christ in the State House prayers. Do you remember anything about that situation?
Yeah, I remember when that was an issue.
Okay.
I don't remember myself being involved in it too much. But what was it you?
Well, basically, it's just that according to the newspaper, I guess you didn't quite agree with the ruling of omitting Jesus Christ from being brought up, I guess, in the State House prayers, but it didn't really go into much detail. So I was wondering, just how big of an issue was this, and how much debate was going on around it.
Well, there was quite a lot of debate going on around it, but it wasn't so much that I was. I mean, yes, I was standing up for the fact that we had at the beginning of every session day in both the House and the Senate, we had a prayer, an opening prayer,
right,
and we invited in ministers for a long time. I mean, it got to the point where it was hard to get ministers to come in, but
sure.
But for a long time, and many times I'd have a minister from my church. He felt honored to be able to come up and give the opening prayer at the legislature, and then but almost every legislator at some point in time would come in, and then their minister would give the opening prayer.
Right.
And my feeling was that the Constitution says that you won't have that the state will not support a particular religion.
Right.
And it doesn't say that the state cannot recognize all religions.
Right.
So my feeling was that, yes, if one of the legislators happened to be of Muslim faith, they could invite their church leader in.
Right.
Or if they were of the Jewish faith, they could invite their rabbi in.
Sure.
And they could give a prayer of however they wanted to give it.
Right.
And there shouldn't be a restriction on who speaks before the House. And if you are agnostic or atheist, you don't have to. You're not required to stay there and listen if you don't want to listen. There was no requirement for that. So my feeling was that, yes, every religion should have the opportunity to come and give an opening prayer if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And it shouldn't be restricted to just Christian, but it shouldn't in any way impose restrictions against Christian belief.
Yeah,
because the Constitution doesn't say that the government has to be so blind as to not recognize religions. It just says that the Constitution says you can't support religions.
Right.
And so, I mean, you can't support a particular religion.
Right, right.
And that all came from England and the formation of our country in the beginning. And our U.S. Constitution has basically the same thing in it as our state Constitution has.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
And they have the difference is I think that the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives has a paid minister who gives a speech. I mean, who gives a prayer.
Yeah.
At the opening of each session. So it's not as free to all religions, but I don't know. Maybe they have restrictions on what the minister will talk about.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that would have been my position on it today, and it was my position then. So
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I got a few more questions, kind of a big picture, kind of reflection questions. What, in your opinion, is the most important work of the Indiana General Assembly?
well, do you want me to talk about the work that the General Assembly does, or what I think the most important work the General Assembly can do?
I would say can do.
All right. Then my feeling is the most important work that the Indiana General Assembly can do is to safeguard our Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And our Constitution is one that provides equal rights to everyone. And so I think at this time, with everything that's going on, our legislatures, not just Indiana, but all legislatures, need to be looking at what they can do to assure that everyone, regardless of their race or color or sexual orientation or whatever, that they have the same rights as everyone else. We're all individuals. We are all different, but we are all protected by the Constitution to have equal rights.
Right.
And there needs to be efforts by legislators to make sure that people are treated equally.
Yeah.
And I think that, and you're not going to be able to pass a law that outlaws racism, because racism is in the hearts of people.
Right.
But you can pass laws that protect people from racism.
Right.
And I think that would be a very important thing for our legislature to work on, is to make sure first of all we protect our Constitution, and secondly to make sure that we uphold what the Constitution says.
Yeah. Sure. How would you summarize your time as a legislator? Like, overall, what do you think about your experiences there?
Well, it's one of those things where I wouldn't. There is no way you could pay me enough to have not done it.
Yeah.
Not served in the legislature, but there's no way you could pay me enough to have me do it again.
Fair enough.
And you know, another misconception that a lot of people have is that legislators are crooked. Legislators are there to get rich.
Yeah.
Legislators are despicable people. Legislators are just like my neighbor next door, either side, across the street.
Yeah.
They're just ordinary people who signed their name to a form, thinking they wouldn't get elected, and then surprisingly did.
Yeah.
And they're serving in the legislature, and most of them don't think of the financial benefits or consequences.
Yeah.
As an example, I worked at Potter and Brumfield, and they were good enough to provide me unpaid leave for however long I needed to serve in the legislature.
Yeah.
In other words, if I was off for 3 months, I would take a 3-month unpaid leave. I'd fill out a form saying I'm leaving this date, and won't be back till this date. Well, if I got back earlier, then they would start paying me when I got back. But the thing is, most people wouldn't believe this, but even with the increases that were made in the pay for legislators over the years, which was done very infrequently, I lost more money with my unpaid leave. It reduced my pension from my work. It reduced my 401k from my work more than what I got paid and any pension benefits and any. I was in the legislature for 40 years, and I get a $600 a month pension.
Mm.
And that period of time I was away reduced what I would get for a pension from Potter and Brumfield by more than what I'm getting. So what I'm trying to say is the overall balance financially,
Yeah.
what I earned at Potter and Brumfield, or what I didn't earn at Potter and Brumfield while I was away, was I lost more than I was paid. But I didn't worry about it. I continued to run because I truly enjoyed serving. I felt fortunate and blessed for people to have confidence in me, to have me there for 40 years, and to never have been defeated in 40 years was, to me, a message from my constituents that I must have been doing something right.
Yeah. Sure. What lessons, if any, did you learn from your time in the legislature?
I'll tell you what, I went to Oakland City University, and I went to University of Evansville, and I could have gone, I mean, if I'd have gone to law school at Indianapolis, which at one point in time before I ran for the legislature, I was thinking about doing that. Or I could, or say, for instance, maybe I would have been able to get into Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there's any institution of higher education better than the Indiana legislature.
Okay.
I think you learn more in that educational institution than you can any college or university around the country.
Yeah.
It's just a daily learning process.
Right.
And I was proud to having been given the opportunity to serve, and shocked that I was able to serve as long as I did.
Sure.
But it was an education every day.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Something new going on all the time. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's good. I mean, I think that's a pretty good answer, because it definitely is a real educational experience that I think many people don't understand at all. You're getting exposed to so many things going on in the state all the time. So
serving on the state budget committee was I remember Uh, I remember on one of our trips to a state park to show you how ignorant I was, and give you an example of something that I had learned. I thought I was going to Pokagon State Park.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I found out that it's Pokagon.
Okay. Yeah.
But no, serving on the state budget committee and traveling around to all of the state properties, higher education institutions, prisons, state forests, state parks, even the casinos. Now we would visit those because they were a revenue source for the state.
Sure.
They didn't gain any revenue from me.
Yeah.
I didn't give them any of my money.
Right.
I majored in mathematics, and one of the things that I learned was statistics, and your chances of coming out a winner over on the long haul at a casino is 0.
Yeah. Yep. Do you?
So
yeah.
So it was very educational.
Sure. Do you have any favorite story or anecdote from your time as a legislator?
Well, my favorite story is serving with my brother, and I was telling you
that
that I had the laptop.
Yep.
Tandy.
Sure.
HD 1100. My brother Donald was the first person to have a computer in the State House. I think even before they had computers in legislative services, he had a Commodore 64.
Ah, yeah, okay, yeah.
Have you heard of that?
I think so. Yeah, I think I've heard of that one. Yeah.
That was one that didn't have a hard drive at all, and
yeah,
no memory whatsoever. It was all floppy drives. I had a Commodore 128 at one point in time, but Donald had the very first computer, and he bought a silver reed printer to go along with, and he let I think he let Mike Phillips give that to one of the secretaries to use, just because everybody, all the secretarial pool had typewriters. I mean, everything was done on a typewriter.
Yeah.
And so if you typed a letter, and you wanted to type the very same letter for another constituent, you had to put the paper in and type it again. And with the Commodore 64 that he took up there with the silver reed printer, you could type the letter, and then you could run that off on the silver reed printer, and then run it off again and write in the names. And I mean, he was providing the first computer into the State House. And if you get a chance to talk to him, I'm sure he can tell you all about that.
Yeah.
Because he kind of thinks that the House was right up there with the Senate when it comes to computerization. But the difference is we developed the system and had it developed, and then the House started using it too. But we developed it first. So if he tells you they did.
Oh, boy. Let's see. What advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Boy, if I thought there was any chance that I could give advice to a legislator and they would actually listen,
yeah,
my advice to the legislature, to a legislator, would be stand by your own values and do everything you can to make sure that what you do is in compliance with the Constitution,
right,
and is treating everyone equally.
Yeah.
And just try to spend as much time with your family as you can.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
That's important, and you don't realize how important it is until it's too late.
Right. Sure. What, if any, enduring qualities do Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
Pardon me?
When it comes to thinking about the people of Indiana, what, if any, enduring qualities do you think Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
Well, I think generally the people of Indiana still have the same values that Hoosiers have always had, and that is their love of their family,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just trying to do the best with what they've got and what they can. So I think Hoosiers haven't really changed that much. Although I do believe that the divisiveness of cable news,
Yeah.
and social media
Mm-hmm.
has somehow caused them to overlook some of the values that they have held dear all of this time.
Yeah.
And they're letting those stories that they see, and the twists that are placed on those stories influence their thinking. But I think generally that most Hoosiers are still very good people, and
Mm-hmm.
care very much about their state, and care very much about their country.
Sure.
I just wish they'd care enough that they'd vote Democratic, but
Yeah.
but it seems to have taken a turn the other direction.
Yeah. Okay. What about the state of Indiana as a whole? How have you seen the state change since you've been a lifelong Indiana resident?
Well, I think that probably the biggest change that I've seen, and part of this occurred over the 40 years that I was in there, and I'm not saying that I take credit for it. It's just
Right.
that I've seen these changes. We've gone from a society that was your opportunities were limited to a greater degree than they are today.
Hmm.
To give you an example, we have scattered across this state so many institutions of higher education that almost every person who wants to improve their education is within driving distance of institution of higher education.
Yeah.
And I think those opportunities for education are better than they were.
Okay.
I think that we've really improved that. We've improved the transportation system. My brother and I worked on trying to get I-69 through and fighting an uphill battle. We weren't in a position where we could make it happen, but we were in a position to make people understand how important it was.
Sure.
And we kept working on that for years and years and years before there was ever a spade of dirt turn. And I think we, especially in southern Indiana, we have better transportation systems now than we had 40 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. That makes sense.
So better access to education, better transportation. I don't know. Offhand, I can't think of anything.
No, that's good. Yeah.
Profound.
All right. Let's see. I have one more question for you. What do you want Hoosiers to know about their role in relation to the function of the Indiana General Assembly?
Their role?
Yes, like how they affect, how the Indiana General Assembly works. What would you like them to know about that process and their part in it?
Well, I would first of all say that in every situation, that their input will not change the outcome. Mm-hmm. But there are certain situations where their input will certainly improve the outcome.
Yeah.
And to give you an example of what I mean by that is, I think that the efforts of teachers have made an impact on the funding of education. Mm-hmm. And they've made an impact on some of the legislators think that they I haven't thought about this, but I think it's some of the legislators are just the opposite of Donald Trump. Donald Trump thinks testing is a bad thing because it makes the virus spread more. Mm-hmm. And legislators think that testing is a good thing because the more you test, the better. And my feeling is that testing in schools has always been done. Teachers do it every day or every week. Mm-hmm. It's always for us to establish all of these tests that the schools are required to give takes away from education time. Yeah. It's like a good friend of mine who was a Republican senator from Evansville, Greg Server. Mm-hmm. I remember him speaking on a bill dealing with testing, and he said, "It doesn't matter how many times you weigh a pig; it's not going to make it any fatter."
Right.
And he was referring to it doesn't matter how many times you test a child, you're not going to make them any smarter by testing.
Yeah, sure.
So it's and I don't know how I got started on that, but what was your question again?
Oh, just what's the role of Hoosiers when it comes to, the relation?
Yeah, well, yeah. My point was that yes, I think that for your particular interest,
yeah,
as a citizen of the state of Indiana, contacting and working with your legislator is extremely important.
Yeah.
Based on my experience, so much of the legislation that I worked on and got passed and feel was a good accomplishment was something that a constituent brought a particular problem to me, and I saw where that we could help resolve that problem with legislation. Mm-hmm. So I would really encourage people to work with their legislators. If the legislators have a legislative forum, go to it and talk to the legislators. Don't just sit there and listen. Go to it and talk to the legislators and tell them what you're concerned about. Let them know that.
Right.
Because I do think that legislators do listen. And unless they're all a lot smarter than I was or am, they don't know everything.
Right.
And they can learn a lot from their constituents. So I just thoroughly encourage them to interact with their legislators. Don't sign a card that somebody gives you that says I'm for this or I'm for that or I'm against this or I'm against that. Don't sign a card that's pre-printed and send that in and think it's going to have any impact at all on the legislator.
Right.
And the only thing that happens to those is a staff person will get your name and address and send you a form letter.
Yeah.
And that's and the legislator's never going to see those cards and never going to know what your name or opinion was. But if you send a handwritten letter or one that you've prepared on word processor or whatever, and you signed it, and it's your own thoughts and your own words, that legislator will read that, and it'll have an impact on him or her.
Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Enjoyed talking to you.
All right. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.